President Donald Trump's executive orders laid out a blanket 25% tariff on Canadian goods imported into the United States, except for energy. Canadian energy will carry a lower tariff of 10%. These tariffs went into effect at midnight on Tuesday, March 4th, sending U.S. markets into a dramatic sell-off. Steel and aluminum imports.
That makes sense. I actually didn't realize that these had already taken effect. That certainly explains why the market started to go down so quickly, was that exact phenomenon.
Will also be subject to a levy. It's unclear which tariffs will last. Trump has since altered, paused, or canceled some of the tariffs. But the threat of the tariffs has prompted a strong response from Canadian leadership.
Our tariffs will remain in place until the U.S. tariffs are withdrawn, and not a moment sooner.
Canada announced retaliatory tariffs, including a 25% tariff on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods on March 4th, with an additional 25% tariff on over $20 billion in U.S. imports that took effect on Thursday, March 13th. These measures come in response to the U.S. implementing additional steel and aluminum tariffs on Wednesday, March 12th, with the total scope potentially increasing to $155 billion. Tariffs will likely increase prices for American consumers, especially in states with a high share of imports from Canada, such as Montana, Maine, Vermont, North Dakota, and Wyoming.
That is particularly interesting. I didn't realize that there were some states that had more Canadian imports. If anything, I would have assumed it was just the northernmost states. So it's actually interesting that it actually gets pretty far south in the Midwest.
This is not how neighbors treat one another, and certainly not best friends.
In what appears to be an escalation of the dispute, Trump has repeatedly called Canada the, quote, 51st state.
So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
What he wants is to see a total collapse of the Canadian economy, because that'll make it easier to annex us, is the second half of his thought. Now, first of all, that's never going to happen. We will never be the 51st state. But yeah, he can do damage to the Canadian economy.
Here's how this trade dispute will impact American and Canadian consumers, and what this could mean for the future relationship of the two countries.
I'm not sure if that was that great of a pep talk. It's just like, yeah, he's planning on hurting us. It will work. So I guess at least he added but we're not going to give in and become part of America, but probably not the most uplifting speech he could have had right there.
The United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend. Canadians are reasonable, and we are polite, but we will not back down from a fight.
Trump has given different reasons to the media for this, even though, the official documentation is that this is an emergency related to fentanyl on the border. He's also talked about the Keystone Pipeline. He's talked about the trade imbalance. He's talked about the trade deal that we have with Canada. So it's really confusing to figure out, what is the U.S. trying to negotiate on here.
Trump's executive orders outline several reasons for the levies, including to stop drugs and undocumented people from entering the U.S.
I think
it's reasonable to say it's unclear exactly which one's the primary factor, but I think it is very reasonable to say that it's multifaceted. You might not just put a policy in place for another country just for one specific reason and one specific reason only. I could see him wanting to stop drugs and also to stop illegal immigration and also to offset a trade deficit. I don't think it's unreasonable to not care about anything else and that every decision has to have exactly one rationale behind it. I think most decisions in businesses, for instance, are multifaceted. I'm sure decisions you make in your personal life are multifaceted. Like, where do you live, for instance? That probably has to do with your family, your upbringing, schools, jobs, maybe nature, infrastructure. There's so many things that impact a decision like that for us on a somewhat regular basis. And so life is complex. I could see why most policy changes would need to impact a variety of aspects of things that maybe aren't as favorable today as they would like.
Concerned that the border could be strengthened, and I think there are plans in place that the Trudeau government has put forward in terms of a $1.3 billion border plan, the undocumented migrants, as well as the fentanyl trade. That said, I think it's overstated in terms of the Trump administration's focus areas. They went from that to a trade imbalance with Canada and China and Mexico as another reason, and then it goes to the America First policy, which is around reshoring jobs and capital to the United States. And so the puck keeps moving, to use a really Canadian analogy.
One of the big issues with the tariff threat on Canada is that the argument doesn't really apply to Canada. This is about fentanyl and illegal border crossings. That's what this emergency declaration is. That's certainly an issue broadly, but not necessarily a specific issue with Canada.
We're not going to bend. We've been ripped off as a country for many, many years. We've been subjected to costs that we shouldn't be subjected to.
In response to CNBC's request for comment, a White House spokesperson said President Trump will again use tariffs to level the playing field for American workers and reignite America's industrial might.
Trade policy is going to change, and we are going to make it fair to Americans. I know people worry about short term, but we are going to bring jobs, trillions and trillions of dollars of production is going to come back to America, creating great jobs in.
So this is definitely a very long-term strategy. Some of you might have seen some of our other videos, but in some cases, this could take 4 to 8 years, maybe even longer, depending on which industry this is and how far behind that industry is at this point in time. And so this isn't something where you put a tariff on and then sort of attempt to level the playing field, and then overnight everything just balances out. This is going to be a steady and slow progress as long as those tariffs are in place. And that's one thing that I think is unclear at this point in time, which is Trump has sort of instigated tariffs, then paused them, put them back in, pulled them back. And so this is something where, like, he would need to commit to these for a very long time, at least throughout his presidency, for this to be a possibility of it impacting industries in America, in my opinion. And potentially even some of this to extend beyond his presidency if whoever takes office next also believes in this idea and starts to see the fruits of that change, then maybe they would continue it to help propagate industry in America. But it's certainly not something that happens overnight. It's certainly going to be a multi-year process because, again, in many cases for something that's really fundamental, like aluminum or steel or lumber, etc., you'd likely need to make large manufacturing plants or some type of processing location. That could take a lot of money that you need to accumulate. They need to find the land, architect it, build it out. And so that's going to take years just in and of itself. And then you actually need to start processing and producing the good. And so that could take years before they actually benefit and can actually ramp up. So again, this is likely, I would estimate, probably 4 to 8 years for most industries to kind of turn things around. So it's going to take a very long time.
America, and that's why the Americans elected Donald Trump, and he's going to deliver for them.
It's what he campaigned on, wanting to raise tariffs, wanting to use tariffs for revenue. And if you're using tariffs for revenue, that precludes them from being a negotiation tool because you have to have the tariff stay in place for it to raise revenue. You have to be able to lift the tariff for it to be a negotiating tool.
In 2020, Congress passed the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement.
That last individual seems to be very anti-tariffs. I think you could also negotiate with the percentage of tariffs. You could use it for revenue generation and for negotiation power because the choices aren't necessarily tariff or no tariff. It could be higher tariff or lower tariff. And so, again, they seem to be having issues with this, like, what I would consider multifaceted argument that's being made, and the fact that it's not just like a yes or no, true or false scenario that exists. And so they just seem to be very negative and seem to be making a number of assumptions in their argument.
Or USMCA, which replaced NAFTA and was one of the Trump administration's economic and political priorities of his first term.
I think another big issue that these tariff threats raise is that it's Trump who negotiated this trade deal that we have with Canada and with Mexico now. And when he negotiated it, it was said by him, this is one of the best trade deals ever. And now here we are just a few years later, potentially ripping it up and placing tariffs on our close ally and trading partner, Canada.
I think that's a reasonable argument to take Trump's own plans and saying how things didn't work in the past and how he's sort of switching how he's doing things. With that said, I think it is reasonable overall. I would hope all leaders in any fields learn from their mistakes and try new things. And myself, as being a leader within my own field and within my own company, I attempt to make changes that are positive. And my hope is that if something isn't working out, I'd rather try to make something different so I can learn what the right way is than just let it not be good. And so that way we eventually can get into a better state. And if you just keep repeating this process, hopefully you'll eventually be much better off. One other thing that I would call out for this individual that I feel like she's also sort of glossing over in this argument is that it's not like in Biden's presidency that we had zero tariffs. And again, I might be defending Trump probably too much here, but I feel like this person is just kind of glossing over so much of the argument that it feels too biased to just let it linger and stay as is. But it's not like Canada or Mexico had a zero tariff from America on goods prior to these changes, which again, she sort of highlighted earlier and almost made as an argument of you need to be able to remove the tariffs for them to be effective for negotiation. But again, it's not like we live in a world where they never had any tariffs at all. The distinction here is how large are those tariffs? And just want to highlight that as we seem to be glossing over. It's not like Trump had the idea of tariff and was like, I'm just going to create tariffs for everything, everywhere, out of nowhere. We've never had these before. That's not the case. What he's doing is he's drastically increasing the size of those tariffs for certain sectors that he believes should have larger tariffs on them, and especially for areas that he's targeting for one reason or another.
And I think that just sets the stage for a new era of trade policy, and one where the U.S. may not be as reliable as trading partner as we used to be.
How dare our best friend do this to us? If you don't want to waste the crisis, so to speak.
Wow, this guy seems hurt. How dare they? He's really into this best friend thing also.
I would say the best thing that's happened is that finally Canadians have come together politically, as well as the populace has come together and said, we need to get our own house in order here. We are beholden to this unreliable neighbor to the south now, and the whims of that neighbor are making us finally ask the questions of what do we need to do to become stronger and more prosperous as a country?
A tariff is a type.
So that last question he sort of ended on, I don't think is a bad question. I think it is baked in with the assumption of being bad trade partners, but presumably every government should be asking themselves that exact question on a pretty regular basis, which is how can we be better set up for our citizens today than we were a year ago or 10 years ago? That, in my mind, is the explicit purpose of the government, is that they should be looking out for the well-being of their citizens and improving the situation for citizens year after year, year after year. The presidency, the term after term, president after president, all those things. And so I don't know if I disagree with anything that I said. I think that is very reasonable. You as a country probably shouldn't assume anybody, especially based off of best friend status, since that's not a legal status to be in, or some type of alliance status. That is just we assume this country is always going to do X for us or Y or Z. And so we're just going to not do those things as well. And I think that's exactly why Trump is making these tariffs right now, is the US has become reliant on certain countries for particular purposes, and that we sort of degraded. I think a great example is we just had a video on aluminum and some of the tariffs that are going in there. And they've highlighted how we used to have like 30 smelting plants. I think it was like 30, 50 years ago. I don't remember the exact timing on that one, but it was not that long ago. And now we have 4. So like we've completely atrophied in this area. And so this is an issue that we are now so dependent on other individuals that it seems reasonable to me that we're trying to solidify our own stance and our ability to manufacture and produce goods that are very important to our economy.
Of tax that applies to imported goods. It's paid by the person in the country or the business in the country where the importing is happening.
More than 60% of the crude oil imported into the U.S. in December 2024 came from Canada. Canada also exports a large amount of electricity to the U.S. That means the cost of gasoline and electricity may rise for some Americans. The auto industry will also be heavily impacted by the tariffs on both Canada and Mexico.
So this is an argument that I think is a very good argument to make, and I feel like they should have spent more time on this because they did highlight how Trump mentioned as part of his attempt to become a president was tariffs was going to be part of his policy. So that shouldn't be particularly surprising to anyone. He said, if you make me president, I'm going to make tariffs. And so people presumably voted for tariffs, or at least tariffs being part of the policy of the president that they were selecting. But this is one that I think is a much stronger argument to be making, which is tariffs are almost exclusively the opposite of making things more affordable for Americans, where, again, they just increase the price of usually very cheap goods. The reason why you would want a tariff is because something is so cheap that it is out competing domestic production. And so that means basically something is so cheap in Canada or Mexico or China or wherever it is that we basically don't make it anymore in America. And so you're going to add a tariff to increase that price. And all that does is increase the price of the cheapest option that we had available to us. And so it just raises prices, broadly speaking. And that seems very contradictory to what he campaigned for. He is doing other things, obviously, like with Doge and like the gold card, etc., that are likely ways that he's looking to offset some of those increases for maybe giving back tax credits or something along those lines to Americans, maybe in an attempt to offset the cost. So hopefully his thinking is it's going to net be positive for tariffs and consumer goods to be up, but then you're going to pay less on taxes and you'll be better off for the combination of those things. We'll see where that goes, but I think tariffs are sort of against his other part of his campaign, which was making things cheaper.
Average vehicle could increase by nearly $6,000 in the U.S. based on one estimate from investment bank Benchmark Co. That amount could change as tariff negotiations continue. The U.S. government will collect revenue from the tariffs, but that revenue comes with some downsides.
Tariffs are a really bad way to raise revenue. They come with a lot of economic distortions that other types of taxes don't come with. So you have just the negative effect of the tax increase. You also have an additional negative effect in that tariffs can reduce incentives for innovation and for competition because they are effectively shielding domestic companies from import competition.
I think that is a reasonable argument that she's making here. So the primary arguments that she's making is basically because we're artificially reducing competition. So again, in that case of, let's say something is made more cheaply in Canada than the US, by them forcing the Canadian prices to increase, that means basically the American company can just do what they're currently doing to earn a profit compared to that Canadian company, even though that Canadian company might have innovated a lot in order to get that advantage that they currently have. And so if you basically overdo it on tariffs, what could happen is you can rest on your laurels as a company and a country and say, all right, well, we already manufacture this thing and tariffs are going up, so we don't really need to do anything better. We don't need to cut our costs because there really isn't anyone else in competition. It sort of makes a sort of monopoly where the manufacturing in the US can basically overcome it. But again, that happens in more extreme cases of tariffs, and it's very unclear exactly what the right amount is. I don't know how somebody would actually figure out the perfect amount of tariff percentage. I think, as she mentioned, it is pretty complex and there's a lot of ramifications. I think her other argument is if it's purely for revenue, there's other ways of doing it. I think the obvious other way to do that would have been increased taxes. And so, again, that's something that he wasn't campaigning for. So I think it's a reasonable argument to make of there is other more straightforward ways of increasing revenue for the government. But again, I don't think that's part of his general campaign strategy.
We import roughly $400 billion worth of goods from Canada each year. If we place a 25% tax on most of those goods and a 10% tax on energy-related goods, that will raise tax revenue for the federal government. Now, it'll raise less than just taking 25% times 400 because people will change their behavior. People will import less. And so when you account for all of these shifts in behavior and how tax revenues change, We estimate that tariffs proposed go into effect on Canada would raise federal tax revenue by about $36 billion in 2025. And if you divide that across all households in the United States, that adds up to about $270 in additional taxes paid because of the tariffs on Canada.
The broader global economy would also likely take a hit from these tariff measures.
It is a game of chicken, but I would say that the American side has the bigger stick in this game, and that's what's being able to be driven out of this economic policy, which is really using its economic weight.
The tariffs.
Agreed. I think this is a great point that this individual is bringing up, which I feel like doesn't get as much attention, which is Trump is doing this because he can get away with it. America right now is doing so well financially compared to so many countries. At this point in time, some of those countries were hit much harder by inflation, for instance. And so right now is arguably the best time to throw your financial weight around, where you could say, well, our economy is doing pretty well. We do the most consumption in the world. We're spending so much money on your goods, and we're having such a large influx of money going into your particular country, in essence, supporting your economy to some extent. So if I add tariffs, then I know the money from my citizens are not going to go as much over to your country, and they'll stay within my country. And we're in such a good spot that even if there's some poor ramifications, we can live with it. But can you live with the consequences of not having that $400 billion come into your country? And I think that's really hard to say, especially for Canada. Canada's been in a pretty rough shape recently, and so this is where it is going to hurt for them. And I think they can do these retaliatory tariff segments, but again, there is a trade deficit, which means we are buying more goods and importing more goods from Canada than they are to us, which means if we just assumed we just completely stopped trading at all together, then the US would just net more money saved than Canadians. And so that's where it is sort of an empty threat, even though it will have a negative ramification if they retaliate, but it's not that big of a deal for Americans. It's going to hurt Canadians much more right now. Presumably, the much more tricky aspect is if a country did this to us when we were struggling financially. And this creates the scenario where Canada in the future, if they're doing better than us financially, could use the same playbook and do it back to us. But I don't know the history of tariff and trade wars that have previously existed and whether or not they have done it to us in the past or not. But basically, this is something where the US is sort of kicking other countries when they're down because we're not as far down at this point. And so that is effectively using your power for influence. And so hopefully it is for the betterment of the US citizens.
Would harm all economies involved, including the US economy. But if they're really steep and really broad, because Canada and Mexico, such a large share of their economy is trade with the United States, it could very well cause much more economic hurt to their countries, to businesses in their countries, than it does to the United States. It wouldn't be likely that the US falls into an overall recession because of these tariffs. It could very well be the case that that could happen in Canada and Mexico.
This is something that is going to have an adverse impact on US GDP. Estimates about the impact, it's going to range anywhere from 20 basis points to 150 basis points of a negative impact on US GDP overall. And that will impact everything.
Tariffs are meant to be one-time economic shocks. This seems like one that might be more than one-off, and it may create structural change in the Canadian economy and then vice versa, potentially in the United States. The US side can sustain this trade war much longer than the Canadian side can, simply because of the size of the economy. I think everyone's taking a preparatory stance and posture with what's happening in the United States. Canada and the US will always be very significant trading partners, regardless of the tariff environment. The world order is being upset, though, because the two closest allies in the world, the two best friends in the world, one bigger than the other, fair enough, are in a spat. And this is not how neighbors treat one another, and certainly not best friends. And so there is going to be...
He keeps saying this best friends thing. I'm not entirely sure what his background is or why he keeps saying this phrase, but it wasn't clear whether he's American or Canadian. And so it's so odd that he keeps bringing this up as best friends in this argument. I do think it's reasonable to say these are our closest allies, and therefore this could lead to future issues or harsher trade agreements between US and Canada. But again, I think that's something that Trump is willing to take on, and that's why he's doing it right now.
this restructuring of our relationship between Canada and the US, but I don't think we need to disengage from the United States. I think that would be a really big mistake for Canada.
I see. So he just said we, so he's clearly Canadian, and that explains why he's so upset about our best friends, the US citizens or the US government, being so mean to the Canadians, which is fair. If I was Canadian, I'd probably be upset about this. This is certainly not a nice thing that Trump is doing to Canada. But I do agree with his other point, which is I can't imagine that this just ends trade with Canada. Canada has so much trade for the US. Likely it would weaken trade between the two countries. But again, that's ultimately Trump's goal. His goal isn't to increase trade between us and Canada. His entire premise of adding these tariffs is to decrease the trade. So it is accomplishing his goal that he's aiming for. But I still suspect Canada and Mexico would still have a lot of trade with us, just based purely on geographic locations and how close we are. It's just going to be so much easier than transporting goods halfway around the world just to avoid some tariffs, when it's likely going to still be more beneficial to just trade with somebody close by.
But it will be a different relationship moving forward.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. We'll see you around.